What's going on, everybody? My name is Adam. Welcome to Sanctify Studios, where I like to create and examine content with a sanctifying biblical view. For today's episode, I wanted to change things up a little bit. Normally what I do is either host an interview or a podcast, or I would be doing some sort of reaction video to Christian rock or metal. For today, I wanted to change things up and give you my recommendations for the top 15 podcasts that you should be listening to. Couple of disclaimers. I listen to Christian rock and metal, and I also am involved on worship teams, so some of these are definitely going to lean towards Christian rock and metal and worship, but I made sure to still include some general Christian podcasts that I think you should be listening to that are just general faith-based, helping you in your sanctification journey kind of podcasts that I think you'll really enjoy. But before we get into that, I want to encourage you to go ahead and leave this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. All of this really does help me out in being able to reach more people on this channel. And go ahead and leave me a comment below with some of the different content that you want me to be doing, whether that's reacting to some different bands, some different genres. Maybe you like this kind of content. We're going to be talking about podcasts and other things like that. Leave a comment below and let me know. With that out of the way, let's get into the first podcast. And, no particular order for right now. The first podcast I want to mention is a podcast called Cooper Stuff. Cooper Stuff is a podcast that's hosted by John Cooper. He's the singer of Skillet, and this you would think would lean more in that like Christian rock and metal direction, but it's actually far more of a podcast about culture, a little bit about politics, a little bit about church culture. But what John Cooper does is he takes things that are going on in the church, things that are going on in politics, things that are going on in the culture, and he really does bring it to a biblical mindset. He's able to provide biblical references. He's able to provide good conversation and discussion towards a biblical mindset, and he does regularly bring on guests who write books and who are intellectuals in the Christian and even political spaces, to be able to talk on a lot of these topics so that we can all just have a different perspective than what we're hearing from the world. Honestly, I think that that's the best thing that he provides. It's a different perspective. Is he right in everything? No, and I think he would admit to that. Is he, a little bit energetic about the things that he talks about? Absolutely. It's John Cooper, of course, and he's also a rock star, so he's going to bring that energy to his podcast. But his intentions are, from what it seems, 100% pure. And it's so awesome to be able to see someone from the Christian rock and metal community speaking out about a lot of the things that he talks about. So the first one is going to be Cooper Stuff. And that's a video that you can find on YouTube. He puts out videos on YouTube, and you can find it on Spotify and other podcast applications. The second podcast that I want to mention is a podcast called the KINGDOMCORE podcast. So the KINGDOMCORE podcast is definitely a podcast that leans more towards Christian metal. It's two guys, Sean and Christopher. Christopher is in charge of the For the Rock Instagram page and YouTube channel. He does a lot of reactions on his YouTube channel, and he's very involved with Christian artwork and the Christian community, both in Christian rock and Christian metal. And both of them do this podcast called the KINGDOMCORE podcast, where they'll either discuss things together, they'll have on guests from different Christian metal bands, and they will talk about the music, they'll talk about the writing of the music, the songs, they'll talk about things going on in their lives, they'll talk about their views on a lot of things. They're a really entertaining podcast to listen to, and a really entertaining podcast to watch. And so if you're someone who likes to listen to Christian metal and wants to know more about these bands like Phineas and Holy Name and Confessions of a Traitor, and I think they just had one with Then It Ends, they're the podcasts that you want to listen to, because you'll feel right at home listening to them. The third podcast I want to recommend is a podcast called CEASEFIRE. The CEASEFIRE podcast is hosted by two guys, and one of them is actually the lead singer for Project 86, Andrew Schwab. And it's really cool because their goal is basically to talk about different cultural issues and sometimes political issues, but they really try to lean more into the cultural. They're really trying to make sure things are very middle ground, and they're trying to take the two sides, the two polarizing sides in a lot of cultural issues, whether that be like Christian and non-Christian, Democrat versus Republican, or whatever other polarizing groups you can think of. And they really try to say, hey, let's ceasefire and talk about these issues. Let's really try to understand where both sides are coming from, and let's discuss these things in an intellectual way so that we can better understand what kind of mindset that we can have that unifies us in those issues rather than divides us. It's a really, really cool podcast. It just started not too long ago, and so you're definitely going to want to go check that out. Ceasefire podcast with Andrew Schwab, and I forgot who the other host is, but he's like a super awesome, well-known gamer. And so they're super entertaining together. They have guests on there as well, so you're definitely going to want to check that out. Ceasefire podcast. The fourth podcast I want to recommend to you is actually a personal favorite of mine, Backstage with Mothership on Solid Rock Radio. This podcast feels like home to me. It really, really does, because Cindy Blankenship, I think that's her name. Everybody calls her Mothership. She does these interviews on Solid Rock Radio where she talks with bands that like I've been listening to pretty much all my life. If you enjoy Skillet, if you enjoy Spoken, if you enjoy Disciple, Seventh Day Slumber, The Protest, Relent, Zana, her husband Nesdum, if you enjoy that circle of bands, Decipher Down, GFM, she's interviewed so many people from the Christian rock and metal world. It's just so awesome to see that she's so connected with the community, and it feels like home because it's so laid back, it's so personal, and it's so nice. It's just so nice. You can tell that when she's interviewing these artists that she feels like family, they feel like she's family, and it just makes you feel like you're listening in at the dinner table with Mothership and these bands. And so, personal favorite of mine, Backstage with Mothership on Solid Rock Radio. If you enjoy Christian rock and a lot of these artists that I mentioned, then you are going to feel right at home in that podcast. Podcast number 5 that I'd love to recommend to you is a podcast called Trevor Talks. Now, Trevor's also really connected with the Christian rock and metal community, but he kind of tackles things in a little bit of a different angle. He's much more focused on mental health and emotional well-being, and talking to a lot of these artists with the hope of uniting all of us to really try to focus on loving and being encouraging to one another. He's really close with the projects of Heart Support. He's hosted some of their events online, and when you listen to his interviews, you can just tell that he really cares about people. He really cares about the health of someone's heart and the health of someone's mind and the health of someone's relationships. He really just wants to get into the details of what has made someone successful in not just their music and not just their careers and not just the things that they're known for being successful in, but how have you been successful in being able to manage the hardships you've dealt with and the heart issues and the mental issues and all those things. He's got a really great heart for tackling things like that. So if those are things that you're struggling with, if those are things that you want help with, if those are things you want to hear a lot of conversations about, then Trevor Talks podcast is definitely the podcast for you. Podcast number 6 that I'd really love to recommend to you is a podcast called Heavy Worship Nation. Now, Heavy Worship Nation is made up of 2 girls from Texas, and they are on fire for Christ right now. They are trying to reach out to their local community there in Texas, and as they were doing that, they found that, hey, there's a lot of people who are connecting with this heavy worship and connecting with this mentality of wanting to come together. And so what started as just this Texas outreach to find like-minded people ended up becoming a countrywide thing, where now me from California is connected with them. James Franchise from New York has connected with them. Different people from different states have connected with them and just said, hey, we believe in what you're talking about. We believe in what you're doing. And it's just so awesome to see them so on fire. It's so awesome to hear them have a heart for Christian musicians and a heart for outreach through music and worship through heavy music. And if you listen to any one of their episodes, it's so awesome. They present the gospel at the end of every episode, and I think that their hearts are pure and genuine in wanting to spread the gospel through heavy music. And I think that for any of us who are in that kind of community and want to feel encouraged by someone who has that kind of a heart and wants to like be encouraged to have that heart, you know, ourselves, Heavy Worship Nation is a great podcast to listen to. And it's also a great way to, again, get to know some of those other artists in the community of Christian metal and Christian rock. We're just about halfway through our list. Up for number 7 is a podcast called Rock in a Hard Place, a Cutlass podcast. Now, just like Cooper stuff, you might be thinking like, oh, is this going to lean more towards like Christian rock and metal? Are they going to be talking about music the whole time? Well, actually, the lead singer, John Micah, and the guitarist, James Mead, they definitely do talk about the origin of Cutlass and their time on the road and some background information about their new songs and everything. And that's like super cool. That's awesome. But they honestly talk a lot more about their testimonies and their backgrounds and things that they were going through mentally and emotionally, things that they had to grow through, hardships that they faced, even things like being influencers in the Christian community, but seeing hypocrisy, seeing things that were not good and trying to navigate through those things, having expectations placed on them while they were dealing with a lot of their mental and emotional hardships. It's really a great podcast to listen to if you're dealing with things like that, because they speak so much encouragement. They really do want to encourage people who are going through those things to seek help. And I think that they have come to a place where they don't believe that you should not go to church for those things, but they believe that the church should be trying to equip people to be able to handle those things better. And so it's really cool to see them see some of the shortcomings of the church, but also want the church to be able to overcome those shortcomings so that they can do better and be better for people in this time where there's just so much mental hardships and emotional hardships that people are going through, that they even went through, and are sharing that like, hey, we really needed to work through these things. We still need to work through these things. And so don't be ashamed if you have to work through them too. Like, honestly, that's where a lot of their conversations end up going a lot of the time. And it's super encouraging and it's super awesome. And so, even if you're just a Cutlass fan, it's a great podcast to listen to as a Cutlass fan. But if you are struggling with some of those things and you want to hear a lot of conversations about those things, then A Rock in a Hard Place is definitely the podcast for you. Podcast number 8 is going to be a podcast called All Consuming Podcast. Now, the All Consuming Podcast is kind of like Kingdom Core, where they are definitely leaning more towards the Christian metal, Christian deathcore, definitely the heavier side of Christian metal. But they have some really, really great in-depth conversations about different albums, different artists. They provide a really, really fun perspective. It's basically a party talking about a lot of our favorite bands and a lot of our favorite albums. They go in depth. They share what they were thinking about the albums when they first heard them, what they think of them now. It's a really, really fun podcast to listen to, especially if you're into the heavier side of Christian metal. And so, and they have their own Discord, and that Discord is super active. If you know me, you know that I'm not always on the Discords. I'm a part of a lot of Discords, but it always seems so overwhelming for me. But it's always awesome to go through and see so many people active and so many people posting and sharing their music and sharing memes and sharing like just community with each other and fellowship with each other. And All Consuming podcast, All Consuming Discord was the first Discord that I think I really experienced that in. And it's been super cool to be a part of that. So definitely go and listen to All Consuming Podcast. Podcast number 9 that I'd love to recommend to you is a podcast called The Honest Youth Pastor. Now, if you're on Instagram and you follow, deconstruction or evangelicalism, you'll see that there are a lot of progressive voices and progressive pastors and people who have left the church and decided to, disassociate with Christianity altogether. And from that community has sparked this pastor, and I guess a youth pastor, who's decided to bring some clarification to a lot of these things and bring some clarification to a lot of the arguments that they present. He is called the Honest Youth Pastor on Instagram, and he even has his podcast and a YouTube channel where he goes over sermons and he goes over different statements that are made, and he goes to the Bible and corrects them, and he says, you know, hey, these are the things that we have to look out for when we're preaching the Bible and we're preaching truth. We have to make sure that we do it in context. We have to make sure that we're not taking verses out of context. We have to make sure that we're applying the right meaning to what the scriptures are saying when we're talking about different topics. And so he's a really, really great resource if you're like, hey, you know, maybe, you know, I've grown up listening to Joel Osteen, but I've never heard anyone actually listen to a Joel Osteen sermon and go point by point and tell me if what he's actually saying is right or wrong, and what he's actually saying is biblical or not biblical. And that's what the Honest Youth Pastor does on his podcast and YouTube channel. He reads through a lot of these sermons, he pauses, he explains, he says what's good, he says what's not so good, and it's a really, really great way to be able to discern and have someone there helping you to discern what is biblical and what is not biblical. And he's hilarious on Instagram. You at least have to follow him on Instagram because he's posting memes all the time that are absolutely hilarious. And so Honest Youth Pastor, definitely a podcast that you should be listening to. The 10th podcast that I'd love to recommend to you is a podcast called The Worship Review. And I have to thank James Franchise for leading me to this podcast. I never knew about it. He shared it once or twice or something, and I was able to find it through him. And The Worship Review is basically a podcast where, just like the Honest Youth Pastor critiques sermons, the Worship Review critiques worship songs. So they'll go through worship songs and be able to point out, is this worship song actually biblical? Is it not biblical? Can we give this the benefit of the doubt? Maybe they omit something in the beginning of the song, but they bring it in at the end of the song. And it's a fun way to just take the worship songs that we all know and love and have some sort of scriptural, backing to the songs that we sing. Or it's a way to find out that some of the songs that we sing actually don't have a lot of spiritual background behind them or biblical background behind them, and we may actually be better off not singing them altogether. So it's a really, really cool podcast to listen to, especially if you're a worship leader. I think that it's a huge benefit as a worship leader to be able to listen to this and just have a good conscience about the songs that you're sharing with your congregation or the songs that you're playing with on the worship team. If you come across a song that you see is like, this song just isn't biblical, we probably shouldn't be playing it or singing it. That's a conversation that now you can have with your youth pastor, or the conversation you can have with your worship leader, a conversation that you can have with your pastor, and be able to just discern that out. Because I think that we should still, even in our worship, try to maintain good doctrine and try to maintain, obviously, truth. In our worship, we should worship in spirit, but also worship in spirit and in truth. And so the Worship Review helps you to do that. So definitely a podcast that you should be listening to. Podcast number 11 that you should be listening to is a podcast called the Living Waters Podcast. Now, guys, trust me, okay? You have to trust me. This is one that no matter where you are in your sanctification journey, you have got to listen to this podcast, because these guys are so theologically sound and yet so hilarious at the same time. They're entertaining, they're biblical, they're focused on outreach and the gospel, and they just have such a heart for reaching out to reaching out with the gospel to the community and to whoever's listening to the podcast, and through different media outlets and things, and they hand out tracts. Multiple of them go to the beach and they share the gospel with people there at the beach, like legit street preaching. Like they are so on fire for outreach, and they've been doing it for years. The Living Waters ministry is a ministry over here in Bellflower, California, and it's something that I've recently been introduced to. but it's so awesome to see the fruits of their ministry and to see how much they do to try to outreach and proclaim the gospel and provide people with resources and tools to be able to do the same. And that is what this podcast is. Living Waters podcast goes through a bunch of different questions and topics, from church culture stuff to culture stuff, and asks a couple of questions that you might have some confusion on. And they provide some really good perspectives and stories and biblical backing for the things that they say, theologically sound. Like, they are really, really awesome theologically and everything, but they're also super entertaining. Like, they don't take themselves too seriously. They laugh, they joke, like they take jabs at each other every once in a while. Like, it's so much fun. It's definitely another one of those, like, you feel like you're at the dinner table, just kind of in with your family. So definitely a podcast that you should be listening to, the Living Waters podcast. Number 12 on the list of podcasts that you should be listening to is a podcast called The War is Everything podcast. Now, the War is Everything podcast is a podcast put on by the Blue Horizon Digital Network, and that is the network created by the band Blue Fire Horizon. This specific podcast has two of its members hosting it, and it's really, really cool because they bring in a lot of different Christian rock and metal artists, in not just even in metal, but in like punk rock. And they actually brought me on for a podcast, and I was able to talk about Classic Disaster there. It was a really great conversation. But if you listen to these episodes, they get personal, they get biblical, they have fun, they tell jokes. Like, it's really, really cool. And they really try to focus on the up and coming bands. They try to focus on the underground bands. They try to focus on those that like aren't, you know, super popular or anything, but we're a family in this like Christian metal Facebook group family of bands and everything. And so they basically bring everybody from that family into the podcast and talk about the things that are going on in their lives, talk about the things that are going on in their music, and bring a really good sound biblical perspective to it as well. So if you enjoy Christian rock and metal and you enjoy biblical conversation, then that is definitely a podcast that you should be listening to, The War is Everything podcast. We're coming close to the end here, guys. Podcast number 13 that you should be listening to is a podcast called Unbelievable. Unbelievable is a podcast that is such a resource. It is such a resource, especially if you are a Christian who is struggling with doubt right now in an issue of apologetics or a controversial issue, or maybe you wrestle with this dance of theology and science, and maybe you think that they can't coincide, or maybe you are like, hey, what's the difference between some of these different denominations? Anything that could possibly be a debate has been a debate on Unbelievable. It's a podcast where basically they get a believer and a non-believer, or a believer of one denomination and a believer of a different denomination, and they debate issues together with the host of Unbelievable as the mediator, ensuring that it's a fruitful conversation, ensuring that there is understanding on both sides, that they are being gracious in their speech, so there's no yelling back and forth, there's none of this, like, you know, unfortunately American culture stuff going on. They're very intellectual about it. They're very gracious with each other. And it's a very healthy debate so that you can hear the perspective of a believer and you can hear the perspective of a non-believer, and you can weigh out the evidence and be able to weigh out the conversation for yourself. And it's a great tool for you to have answers for a lot of these controversial issues. It's a great tool for you to hear what the different perspectives are, to be able to hear in real time refuting arguments against the Bible, and being able to understand different people's stances on those different issues. So Unbelievable is a amazing podcast to listen to for those things. Honestly, a really great podcast to listen to while you're on a run or while you're doing chores around the house, something that might take an hour or two, because these episodes do go for like an hour or two. It's honestly a great podcast for longer duration activities so that you can really soak in the whole conversation. So Unbelievable, definitely a podcast that you should be listening to. Podcast number 14 on our list is unfortunately seemingly an inactive podcast, and I'm really sad about that. Hopefully they come back, and hopefully this brings them back. It'd be really cool. But podcast number 14 that you should be listening to, at least the episodes that are available, is a podcast called The Dangers of Christian Rock. Ooh, The Dangers of Christian Rock. I found this podcast because I was looking up Christian rock on my podcast app, and this came up, and I was like, what are they going to do? Are they going to talk about how Christian rock is like evil or something? And it's just like me to like hear it out and want to hear the argument so that I can like comment and message and be like, you're wrong, you know. There's nothing dangerous about Christian rock. But no, it's just a name. And so it's actually a podcast that's literally just talking about their childhood in listening to a bunch of these older Christian rock bands, let me give you this list. Bands like Amberlin, 1,000 Foot Crutch, Pillar, Falling Up, Reliant K, I'm pretty sure Switchfoot is in there, Emery. And if any of these are ringing a bell here, then this is the podcast for you. I know that for me, listening to these podcast episodes, I was like, you are my brothers, you are my family. Like these are the songs and the albums and the bands and the music that I grew up listening to, and it was just so awesome to hear them talk about these artists and bands and songs and hear their memories of when they used to listen to them, because you know, we all have our own memories of listening to these bands, and it's so awesome to be able to like compare your memories with their memories and like know, oh, I was in this place when that came out, and like all that stuff. And it does also feel like that same at the dinner table talking with your friends, you know, about these bands, very synonymous with the same feeling you get with like Mothership from Solid Rock Radio. And yeah, so just a really, really great podcast to listen to if you grew up listening to, you know, Pillar, Falling Up, Reliant K, Amberlin, a lot of Tooth and Nail bands, a lot of solid state bands. Definitely the kind of podcast you want to be listening to. All right, everybody, the moment you've all been waiting for. What is the very last podcast that I'm going to recommend? The very last podcast that we should all be listening to, the most important one, and that podcast is yours. Honestly, since I started my podcast, Sanctify Radio, I've been like, how am I going to talk about all the things that I want to talk about? How am I going to have interviews with all of the people that I want to have interviews with? How am I going to like make all these things work? And then like there's this list of a bunch of awesome podcasts, and they're already making awesome content, but I know that it's not for everybody. And so like what is the answer to wanting all these things to be talked about and done, and you know, these conversations to be had, and like, well, I'm only going to reach so many people, and these podcasts are only going to reach so many people. Like, I would much rather encourage you to start your own podcast and to talk about the things that are important to you and to reach out to the people around you in your community. It's time. It's time for you to start your own podcast. And if you're sitting there like, you know, man, nobody's talking about these bands that I love, and I would love for there to be some sort of a conversation around those bands, do it. If you're sitting there like, oh man, these things are happening in the church and no one's talking about it, I wish someone would just talk about it. Talk about it. Do it. I mean, that's literally how Sanctify Studios and Sanctify Radio came to be. I was like, man, it's so awesome to see that there's all these like reaction videos happening for secular artists, but why isn't anybody doing them for Christian artists? Like, why isn't there a bunch of reaction YouTube channels for these Christian rock bands or Christian metal bands? Why isn't anybody talking about these new bands? Why isn't anybody talking about these things? And there were definitely some here and there, but I always felt like, okay, well, they're doing a little bit here, but they didn't get that release, and they didn't get that song, and they didn't react to that music video. It'd be really cool if somebody did. And I was just like, you know what? It's time. I just got to be the one to do it. I just got to be one of the people who is adding to that space. And since then, I've definitely found more, like, you know, Christopher from For the Rock, and Metal 777. There's another guy, he's inactive right now, but if you want to go check out some of his reactions, Lyrical Resonance is another one. There are people doing reactions to Christian music. we're just not a lot of them. We're just not a lot of them right now. And especially with how quickly music is being released, how much I thought I'd be able to keep up with it, and I just haven't done the best job of doing that. If you feel like there's bands that need special attention and should be having reactions done, do it. Make it happen. I would love to see more Christian reaction videos on YouTube. I would love to see more conversations happening about the Christian rock and metal artists that we love. And then, like, even aside from all the Christian rock and metal and hip hop and CCM and worship and all that stuff, I would love to see more Christian, like, people conversating about these church and cultural issues. I would love to see more people talking about the Bible and talking about scripture and talking about theology and talking about outreach. There's definitely like some sort of revival brewing and stirring in America right now. I just feel like there is a pruning happening right now, a separation between those who are willing to be leaders in the faith and those who are going to end up compromising and becoming bystanders in this battle that we're facing in the culture right now, and in the church culture even right now. So be a leader. Be a leader. Be willing to not waver, not compromise your faith, stay biblical, lean on the community around you. Like, if anybody wants to start making content and they want to ask me some of my recommendations, shoot me a message. Absolutely, I'll help you out. Shoot a message over to KINGDOMCORE podcast. Shoot a message to For the Rock. Shoot a message to Metal 777. Shoot a message to go on the Discords and let's conversate there. You have a community to lean on to help you in all these things. You're not alone. You're not alone. And to be honest, all of us are trying to figure it out ourselves, but you're not alone. And there are people in this community who want to see this community grow. And so 15th podcast that we should all be listening to, it's yours. So make sure you get started on that soon. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, then you can do me a huge favor. You can leave this video a thumbs up, you can hit the subscribe button, and you can hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when new videos arrive. And go ahead and leave me a comment below. What did you think about today's video? What are your thoughts? And what do you want to see next on the channel? And if you want to support me and what I'm doing here, one of the best ways that you can do that is to support my band, Classic Disaster. We've got a lot of fun things planned for 2023, so go ahead, follow Classic Disaster, follow Sanctify Studios, and go ahead and subscribe to the podcast Sanctify Radio. Till next time, guys, I will see you in the next video. Take care. Take this to the